Hello there. Welcome to episode 10 of Bow and Blade, a podcast brought to you by medievalists.net, your home for all things medieval on the internet. Bow and Blade gives you a seat at the bar as scholars of medieval warfare go beyond the Wikipedia articles to talk about the debates, the questions that we're working on today. I'm Michael Livingston, professor at the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina.
And I'm Kelly DeVries, professor of medieval history at Loyola University in Maryland.
Oh, and it's a special episode because it is our second episode of Q&A.
Balloons.
Yeah, balloons.
What is what is the 10th anniversary? Is that the balloon anniversary?
So, y'all, we're going to be answering your questions that you sent in, and
we got some good ones. Really good.
Well, at least we're going to be speaking after talking about your questions. Hopefully, we are actually answering in doing so, but we will definitely be talking after having gone over one of your questions. But first things first, man, what are you drinking tonight?
Well, because this is a general session. There's not a specific region or time. I've got to hand it to the archaeologists who found Shackleton's ship, the Endeavour, that went down in the ice and crushed in the ice, but it seems to have been pretty well intact. And there is a Shackleton's whiskey. It's evidently advertised as the stuff that Shackleton took on the voyage. And as those guys all got out, going over the ice, it must have been some pretty good stuff. So I've got a double of it right in front of me. Go Shackleton.
That is awesome. I must talk about Shackleton's the endurance story every semester because it is such a great story to talk about failure. Like they screwed up so many things to be in that position.
Yeah.
But also of sort of, successful leadership. So it's something I talk about a lot. And it is incredible that they found it. The high resolution stuff that's coming up, just so cool.
And I don't usually drink my whiskey, but I think I've got to have an ice cube in this one, just because.
Straight off the ice shelf, right into your cup.
Bravery Shackleton had, and the men too. I mean, incredibly brave to be able to survive the elements down there and so forth. But it's great. It's a great story. I'm glad they found that.
And the pictures. Do we have the pictures to go with it? From the photographer who was with them. Oh, it's so cool.
Amazing.
It's so cool.
Yeah, amazing.
Well, yours is better than mine, Kelly. I'm teetotaling tonight. We have one question. Well, two questions came up that actually involve, at least as we're going to answer them, the Battle of Shrewsbury. And the first time I visited the Battle of Shrewsbury was actually in your company, good sir.
And Bob was savage.
And Bob was with us. Hi, Bob. And I had a Fentiman's ginger beer that was absolutely magnificent for lunch on the site itself. And so I couldn't help but go with a nice good Fentiman's there. Okay. Cheers to everybody back in England.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who gets to have that more regularly than I do.
And we're doing Shrewsbury next, aren't we?
Yeah, we're going to end up talk about this a little bit later on here in the podcast. But yeah, we were inspired by these questions that we're going to take on the Battle of Shrewsbury for our next episode. But today it's question and answer time. And let's start off. Let's get it started. Let's get this party started.
But I want to tell everybody here, Mike, my co-star here, has a book coming out, medievalist book. Meaning that it deals with the medieval world. Go ahead and make the announcement, Mike. It's pretty exciting.
Thank you. So what Kelly's referring to is the announcement was made of a new book I'm doing. Actually, two books coming out this year. The first one's on Crusade coming out this summer, but the second one that he's referring to is through Tor Books, which is a fantasy publisher. But they have asked me to do a book on the origins of the Wheel of Time. So the Wheel of Time is a very famous fantasy series, now an Amazon Prime series that's done very well. And so this is like a book about how that was made, and so that the history behind it, what it was that the author was using. And so there's a lot of medieval stuff in it, because he was using a lot of medieval history and a lot of medieval materials, as well as ancient stuff, ancient warfare stuff, and all kinds of fun things like that. So, yeah, no, thanks for mentioning that, Kelly.
Well,
It's
congratulations on it. It's great. It's great.
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It comes out in November 8th, I think,
Wow.
is when it's
They've
going to
got the
come
date
out.
already.
So yeah. Well, they're it's kind of a big deal apparently. So
Yeah, no,
so
that
they're
would be good. I think that's
uh,
when they're going to be dropping season 2 anyway. So on the TV,
I
so
don't
it'll
think
come out
they've
at
come
that
out with
time.
an announcement on that, but that would be 1 year after season 1 came out.
Yeah,
So and it's a good lead into holidays, So if you're into that kind of stuff, yeah, give me a pre-order. Pre-orders are love. Pre-orders are love.
absolutely, absolutely.
Meanwhile, though, back on the ranch, questions and answers.
Yeah, we got some really good ones, as Mike
Got
said.
some good ones. Beth on our Patreon page asks, I'd like to know practical details, the size of armies, how they're raised, how they're provisioned, and how did an army on campaign communicate with the people back home? What do you think, Kelly?
I'd like to know that too. Beth, that's a great question. It's a big question,
Yeah,
and probably it's one that at the end of this you're going to feel that we haven't really answered it because everything is different. All one every it's each one of these campaigns are different and so forth. So let's just throw out Henry the Fifth's campaign across Normandy after he defeats Harfleur on his way to Agincourt. And, if you've got the practical details there, it's a very small army. In fact, I think the best estimates suggest that it starts out at Harfleur. Now, Anne Curry has found muster rolls and everything like this, so she's kind of taken the numbers up, in a way that puts England at a much larger strength, and that's been debated by certain people. But let's say that it starts out maybe with 2,000 men at arms and about 10,000 archers. It has a very distinct ratio. It seems that is in every source, including what Anne says. The problem is, of course, by the time they get to Agincourt, they've been riddled by dysentery, which has affected the men at arms much more. I've got theories that it's because the men at arms diet is much more varied. The archer's diet is much more grain-like, and that seems to harden the stomach if you eat bread and bread pudding and drink ale. Your stomach's got to go. Okay, bring it on. Dysentery, come on, we can take this stuff. The archers just whip off their pants and keep marching, and the men at arms have to go home. So by the time he gets to Agincourt, he's got many fewer troops,
yeah,
just because he's taken an illness toll there. Same thing we talked about until last week, and the same thing was going on there, where he comes into Italy, and the sickness total on the campaign,
yeah,
which is never really figured because we always talk about the battle, what the numbers of the battle, but a campaign is going to whittle down as you go
right,
along, even if you just leave garrisons behind because you don't want anybody coming on your rear onto your rear.
yeah.
So
And when I reconstructed Agincourt, I estimated that his losses at that point, October 25th, by the time of the battle, the English had around 800 men at arms and 4,500 archers at that point.
yeah,
So they've been whittled down by disease and everything at that point.
as
Which
the
is
longer
which
the
is
campaign, the more disease, more
yeah,
whittling down. Just attrition is an important factor in all this.
yeah,
If the first crusade, we know pretty well what the route was of those crusaders. So from Constantinople, let's say they make it to Constantinople, which not all of them did, make it from Constantinople to the end to Jerusalem. There's probably, we'll just talk about the army, not the Peasants' Crusade, because it didn't last very
yeah,
long, and about 25,000. But it's estimated it could have been as many as around 75,000 with that huge army. That's much larger than any of the forces probably out any other time. And yet, when it hits Antioch and then later at Jerusalem, it's very much smaller. I think we're probably around 10 or even less, 10,000 or even less at that point. and that's just been diseased. They've left a good number in Antioch. Baldwin Baldwin of Boulogne has taken Edessa, and he's got some troops with him. Two or three other spots have been garrisoned along the way, plus they've taken losses in battles, and especially losses to disease
Yeah.
and desertion. We
Yeah.
never talk about desertion. I mean, that's some big people desert there.
All of which, what Kelly's talking around here is when you ask what are the size of armies, one asks which army and at what point, because the size of the army changes drastically sometimes over the course of the campaign, and no two armies are alike in terms of how many men are brought to the field, and outside of a minority of instances, Agincourt being one, because of the work of Anne Curry and some of her team, the amazing work they've done with these muster rolls, we usually don't have really firm records on which we can rely. So we're triangulating stuff, and that always introduces a lot of like question marks. Like we can triangulate from one of those points is the Chronicle account that says it was X number, and sometimes you're like, it can't be, and you might be triangulating from like the Battle of Crusade. We do have the records from the royal from the Tower Armouries about how many materials are being provided there. Well, that kind of implies a number of men, but there's a lot of squishiness to that. There's a lot of squishiness to these numbers.
Yeah.
And it sort of depends on, at some point, one of those triangulation points is almost like, well, what do you want it to be? Do you want this to be this very, very, very small force and greatly outnumbered, and so you kind of favor things to be a little bit smaller? Or do you favor the really large number because it's impressive? So there can be sort of factors that go into determining those numbers that are not, frankly, very objective.
No, and not the same.
Yeah.
Even at the same time.
Yeah.
The other part of that question is a little more easy to answer. How did kings and lords raise armies? How do they provision them? They're really. I've kind of traced three different phases of raising armies. Now, everybody has a core of professional soldiers, so a retinue, bodyguard, whatever. If you're you're good at fighting, you don't have anywhere else. You don't want to go back to the fields or go into the towns and do any work. You're a professional paid soldier. That goes through everything. We don't call them mercenaries. That is simply a paid retinue. Then there's different ways to build a larger army. Early Middle Ages, it appears that it was pretty much a volunteer. We don't have any ideas about recruitment standards or recruitment regulations. Charlemagne has some. So when we hit Charlemagne's reign, he's got this odd thing where he has a body of land called Manse. We're not entirely sure how Manse was measured, but it must have been pretty much the same all around the empire. And if you own 4 manses of land, you had to provide one soldier completely armed and ready to go into battle. If you owned only 2, you had to get somebody else who had 2, and you combined your resources. 1, you have to get with 4 with 1. That's really the first time we've got a regulation. Outside Byzantium does have some regulations we read about, but in the West, that's pretty much it. And then we go into this kind of what we used to call a feudal. It's an obligatory phase, but it's a feudal phase where the counts and the lords, they were required to buy their agreement with the king to bring a certain number of troops, and some of them are pretty standard. The Count of Flanders was the largest, most wealthy count for a long time in high medieval France. He was required to bring 100 horse and 1,000 foot if there was a campaign. Now, the problem is we know that he didn't always answer that way. The King of France, I think it was Robert I, calls a war, and the Count of Flanders sends 2. Not 1,100. He sends 2. 1 to carry his banner, which is just crazy. He wants to have a presence on there. and the other one, we're told, is a bastard son of a knight who wants to get some credibility in fighting. So clearly, the counts as a means of rebellion and as a means of rebellion against a weak king didn't always fulfill that. But
Yeah.
and then at the very end, once the feudal levies stop, and they linger a bit in England and some of the but in France, Low Countries, those have stopped. They start using militias from towns and paying troops. We know, in fact, that's one of the reasons why we have the muster rolls, is so that they know who to pay.
Exactly.
That's why
Exactly.
Anna's got them for the end of the thing. What about provisioning? What do you think on the provisioning?
Provisioning is one of the things that fascinates me a great deal, because one of those things that is often neglected, which is you have to feed all these
Yeah,
people and all their horses and all the cattle, and like there's a lot that goes into this with food. There's a lot that goes into this with horseshoeing, with the carts. You got to have somebody who can repair the carts. You got to have somebody who can repair the tents. Somebody to carry like there's all of this apparatus, and all of it needs food,
yeah,
and all of it needs water. How did they get that? Well, again, it's going to kind of depend on when and where we're looking and what the specific situation is. But your basic options are either you're carrying it with you, which is rough, or you're having to take it from where you're at. Whether you're buying that from people, or more likely, if we're in foreign territory, just take it. I need to eat, and that village over there, I bet, has food. Let's go get it. That's definitely something that happens quite a bit, and you get these devastation zones, sort of peripheral to an army. The army's marching on the road, but to either side, you get this sort of zone of devastation as riders are going out and pulling in everything they can to provision the army as it passes through territory. That's very much something that happens. We have eyewitness accounts of that happening. It's what you would expect to happen. But there is also a lot that is going to be brought with the army or supplied along provisioning lines, supply lines. And that logistics effort can be very vital to the campaign, right? This is, if you go all the way back to Roman times, this is part of why the Roman road system was so important. You march the army somewhere, you build a road behind you so that you can get logistical support to and from where you're going. That's important, and it wasn't something that they forgot. When we get to the Middle Ages, they still knew it.
uh-huh.
So they still had to have that. You have to have your supply line back. You have to have your routes back for communications, for provisions, and all that. So that's my answer.
No, I think you're right, and that of course brings into this idea about how did somebody communicate. There is communication that's frequent, and I think it's pretty quick. I mean, we know, for example, how quick something. One time, Battle of Courtrai is fought in 1302, July 11th, 1302, and we know that the Pope, who was because this is all in a controversy where the Pope is trying, who's Innocent the Third, not Innocent the Third, Boniface the Eighth. Boniface the Eighth has put out a taxation on the churches, and the French and English have refused. The French, especially with Philip IV, and Boniface gets the news about the Battle of Courtrai in less than 2 days, which means that it had to travel faster than it could travel on horseback. And so we've got to have something, some signal stations or something like this. Maybe, the signal stations in the Lord of the Rings on the third, in the Fellowship of the Ring, when we get the signals that go up over the mountains and so forth. We know the Romans did this and had some very specific. So I can imagine that there was some specifics that were able to be delivered quicker than we expected to be. But there and provisions. I mean, we should probably put to rest the idea of an army living off the land. An army that's living
Entirely.
off the land is a lost army at that
Yeah,
point.
if it's doing that entirely, it's got problems.
It's got problems. It's trying to get out of somewhere. Just reading about the
Exactly.
campaign of Julian, Emperor Julian. Last night, I was just reading about Emperor Julian in 363, and the Persians flood the land around outside of Ctesiphon, which is where he is, the direction of the campaign is going, and it literally cuts off his army from their supply coming up the Euphrates River and the Tigris rivers, and they immediately have to try to live off the land, of flooded lands.
Flooded land, yeah, brilliant.
So it does. Let's say this: it doesn't do very much until Julian dies, and then it does less. Just tries to get out after Julian's killed.
It's well played on the Persians' part. Two birds with one stone. Knock out the supply line and make it more difficult for them to live off the land.
Yeah,
and if you're
maybe in this because the Persians were losing, so it was a desperation move, because that also cut off their town, their city, Ctesiphon, from anything outside of it. Then they had to supply the town itself. So logistics, we should probably spend a whole show on logistics and pick some specific campaigns, or maybe even just talk more about logistics when we're dealing with some of these some of the ideas of how does an army live.
Yeah. Well, it's never kind of just one thing, or at least shouldn't be. That's not a very good rule of thumb as a commander. So yeah, it's something we should talk about more. Like I'm always nuts for logistics. And then I'll get people who are sending me nasty notes about how, who cares about logistics?
Well,
the people who need to eat do. The people who need to eat care about it. I don't know where you're getting off. All right. So all right, Beth, I hope we sort of answered.
One quick thing is, I did an article on just a little tiny militia out of Ostend during right after the failure. Burgundy, Philip Good had jumped the English on, and then attacked them at Calais in 1436, and they lose. And so Philip pulls his army all the way back into Burgundy, leaving the Low Countries, his own provinces, the Low Countries, on their own. And Ostend at this time, Ostend now is a resort on the sea. Ostend at that time was just a little tiny village, but we got this great record where it talks about how much has got to be supplied these 10 or 15 men that are out on the dunes, literally on the sea. And it keeps saying, because the Earl, this was the brother of Henry V, who marries Jacqueline of I know I've lost his name all of a sudden. Anyway, they always say because he might attack, and he's on a ship off the coast, so he's ready to attack. And it's hilarious how much they bring to him to eat, and somebody's got so many loaves of bread and so many bits. They get bacon and things like that.
So this account that Kelly's describing is actually in the Medieval Warfare Reader that he and I edited. It's on page 72 if you'd like to read it. Provisions for the Ostend militia, and it's fantastic because repeatedly one of the things that is mentioned is the beer that these guys need. It's so great. There's the fat, and for the candles, some bacon, some beer, and a little bit of this and beer, and a little bit of this and beer, and we need some powder for the weapons and beer.
Right. Well,
it's so great,
and it's interesting because of course they don't have any other water. They've got water, but they don't have any water source. They're literally on the beach. They're on the dunes.
Don't drink salt water, kids. Drink beer.
Not at all. Drink beer. Yes, it is. It's bread and beer. It is. So the militia is having the most boring job in the world, sitting there looking at the sea the whole time, in case this one English ship and an English fleet lands and attacks them. And what are the 10? You might wonder what these 10 guys are going to do if they do attack. But
in the meantime, they're sitting in the sand drinking beer. Good work if you can get it.
National Guard. There you go.
Yeah. So the answer, Beth, is it all depends. It all depends. Yes. But hopefully there's a few more details and snippets of historical moments for you. So next question. And this is a question that my students put to me. My students, some of whom know about the podcast. What's up, cadets? My students asked how much of the past survives. I was talking to them about, like, the survival of Beowulf, what a chance thing that is. And, there's only one copy of Sir Gawain the Green Knight and things. They said, well, given the difficulties, the material surviving, how much did survive? How much got to us? And the reason I thought I would go ahead and bring this question to us here is because, like, some research just came out on this just this past week.
Yeah.
As we're recording this anyway. Might be a few weeks back as this is being aired. This is cool. This is cool stuff. I love this. It's so great because it is a concern that we do not have everything. And so our understandings of things are biased by what has survived. It's basically survivorship bias is what we call this. So we have an impression of the past. That's a lot of P's in that. That depends upon what has survived. And if we're missing pieces, that could have changed the picture that we've got. So it's a very good question, a very important question. And one that, like Kelly and I've had to deal with this our whole careers.
Yeah.
Well, a remarkable study came out. This is so cool. Mike Kestamont and an international team. It's a big team of folks. Really great. I love seeing big teams of folks getting together with all their expertise. And, this person knows this person knows this. You put it all together, you get something way, way cooler. What they did, trying to answer this question, is they looked to ecology. Now, the thing to think about here is if you need to count the number of species on, say, 100-meter block of coral reef. So, you're trying to figure out how many things live there. And so we're going to start counting species. Well, there's no way that you're going to see them all. That's not going to happen. So what they have done over the years is developed these methods, models for this is what we see and this is what we haven't seen. So you actually haven't seen these things, but you can model from what you're seeing to figure out what you have missed. So that's the basic gist. This exists. And this team took that notion from ecology and instead said, okay, well, let's just treat manuscripts as species and let's run the model and figure out what the survival rate is. Like, basically, what is the unseen manuscripts, the unseen species? So taking this model and applying it to manuscripts. And they chose to kind of keep the data set small, I assume. They chose chivalric and heroic stories in Dutch, English, French, German, Icelandic, and Irish. So that was the pool that they chose. And out of that pool, running this modeling, they found that an estimated 9% of the total number of manuscripts that were in existence still survive today. And that in that 91% of manuscripts that have been lost to us, roughly 62% of stories were lost. In other words, kind of the stories that there were of chivalric and heroic stuff in literature, only 38% survives of those stories. We're missing a lot of stories. Obviously, that's kind of limited to those pools of data that they're using, but a really fascinating way of trying to give a number, trying to figure out the denominator. Like, we know how many we've got, but what's the denominator of how many there were to figure out the percentage? So trying to figure that out, it's really, really neat research. I was reading it yesterday. You can tell what party animals Kelly and I are. I was reading this stuff and going through the math. And Kelly was looking at Julian campaign. So yeah, it's a big question. It's a hard question. And this is at least an attempt at giving an answer, which is cool.
It is. And when it comes to looking at medieval warfare, I'm surprised there's some areas. I mean, we found 80 manuscripts that were within 60 years of within 55 years of the Battle of Crusade, or 60 sources. That was extraordinary, and then and we were able to meld them together. And the number of sources on the Battle of Hastings give us a pretty good idea of what was happening as well. But then you get to conflicts. I mean, like battles in the Wars of the Roses, where there isn't a lot known. And you say, well, this is pretty modern. Shouldn't they have? I mean, shouldn't everybody and their brother be writing this down? This is a whole country that's a civil war. And no, it doesn't get recorded. Of course, you go back even further, and you got fewer and fewer sources, and that's an issue. But how many of those would have been recorded in the first place? Who knows? There are cultures, of course, we get in the medieval warfare. There's cultures that don't have a culture of writing. None of the steppe peoples had cultures of writing, so we don't have anything in Mongolian. We have the secret history of Genghis Khan in Chinese. We've got a lot of Persian talk. We've got a lot of Eastern European talk about the Mongols, but they didn't have a culture of writing, nor did the Huns, which we did last podcast. We mentioned this. They didn't have a culture of writing. So some of these people's some of these military situation, campaigns, sieges, battles are not known at all. Sometimes you even guess that they would happen. Those of you've been watching Viking Valhalla, we have no real idea that the Bridge of London was pulled down. That does not exist in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which should have recorded it if it did. It comes much later, and yet it's such a great scene. Everybody wants to refer to it. We don't have any clue about it.
It's a great idea that it happened. I mean,
great idea that it happened. Almost impossible to prove.
Probably didn't.
Yeah.
But it's so cool. So yeah, this issue of what's lost. I mean, yeah, how do you even estimate it? Again, this is a way of trying to do that with literary manuscripts, because that's sort of a tangible thing. But yeah, what's been lost from the history of warfare, boy, that's even harder to try and estimate, right? Yeah. We get into the archaeology. What have we lost? Well, most of it. So what do we got left, and what do we guess from that? If all we have to go from for trying to figure out weaponry is stuff that was found in the tombs of really rich people, that's a problem. And sometimes that is the case. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes we've got great stuff that was found, thrown off a bridge into a river, and we dredge it up and like, oh, look at this sword, look at this cool stuff. That can happen, and that's great. But it isn't always the case. And so, is what we have emblematic of what was common or not? Well, that depends if we know what was common. Do we know that? And so we are constantly fighting this survivorship bias one way or another when we're looking at the past. So yeah, my students brought this up. I thought
and it's one of the reasons why I think the Middle Ages is interesting to study, is once we get past, it kind of falls into our different categories: literature, history. If you do it in the Middle Ages, you use anything. I mean, if I'm teaching Renaissance Europe, and I want to talk about the lead up to, I want to talk about common people's lives, I want to talk about the lead up to Reformation, whatever. Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, man, you got to use it as a historical text. This is what Chaucer sees at that moment. This is how he characterizes certain people in certain places at that moment. And so you use whatever. Art, archaeology, all has to be interpreted, but we put it together and we come up with pretty good stories.
Yeah. A good medievalist, this probably is going to upset someone. I don't know. And any good medievalist who's thinking in terms of like disciplinary walls is not a good medievalist.
No. Interdisciplinary, of course. That's my degrees are all medieval studies, because the interdisciplinarity is so obviously needed.
Yeah.
Study it a little bit.
Yeah, Kelly and I chuckle about that sometimes. I have more history degrees than he does, because he has zero.
Zero.
But what he's got is a history degree, in the sense it's medieval studies. It's inherently there. We love our medieval stuff. It's just,
we do. It really beats. Get the early modern. It gets really kind of sad. Religions fight against each other, all that other stuff.
We have that medieval,
poor, this sort of thing. That's sad.
But yeah, it is fun that I mean, I'm sure maybe in some respects it might seem frustrating that we have so little, and so we have to use so many different kinds of things. But it is part of why we love this.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
what can we use for evidence? How can we glean more information? So yeah, how do we fight survivorship bias? And that's how we do it, is by getting everything we can and
yeah.
bringing it to bear.
You know, we can, and
Uh,
also being aware of new things coming out.
yeah.
There's going to be an article coming out in Journal of Medieval Military History with a couple of letters that had been previously unfound by the Black Prince to Gaston Webu, and I think another one to Bertrand de Guesclin about the massacre at Limoges, both saying essentially that it wasn't as, Froissart may have embellished the numbers a bit, may have been
No.
embellishing it. And
Froissart not telling us the truth? In which of his 5 versions of the Chronicle that he
yeah,
writes that don't match each other? Which one are we
yeah,
talking
I
about?
know, I know. It's I'm shocked.
I'm shocked. I'm shocked to find gambling in this establishment.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Well, it will be.
JMMH
Yeah,
coming
yeah. It's
soon.
good
Coming
stuff
soon. So Bram Meehan on our Patreon page asks, I'm interested in siege mining. I think I get the military purpose of either tunneling under or weakening walls, but what was it like for the miners? Were they recruited? Were they taken away from regular mining jobs, sort of out in the country? Were they in the camp with the rest of the army? How far did they have to tunnel? How long did it take? Talk to us about mining, Kelly.
Well, this is interesting because this is the 500th anniversary of the battle or the siege of Rhodes. We're going to talk about in a little bit, and mining, the explosive mine there, which I'll get to in just a second. Explosive mine is, in my estimation, the determining factor and why Suleiman is able to put breaches in the walls and eventually take it. And that was unusual. Not at that time, it's still in its infancy, but the whole process of mining walls. Now, let me define that for a moment. This is digging underneath a wall to weaken the foundation, so that because a wall it has properties that are somewhat elastic in that it can't exist on its own. If you put a little piece of wall up, it doesn't do anything. People go around it. So these are all kind of attached to each other, which means that they're all based on a single foundation that goes around, and the foundations, the walls are connected. So the idea is, and it's a very ancient one, to dig a tunnel underneath and have that part of the wall collapse. And if that part of the wall collapses, then it brings down everything next to it, walls and towers and so forth, because of the connections. Now, how old is it? Well, archaeologists at Jericho say that there are mines, and they have a number of them. Now, that gives a whole different story, of course, to the idea of the Israelites coming in. They walk around the town for like 7 days, and then they blow a trumpet, and the walls fall down. And what could have happened, if we're looking at it in something other than God came down and just pushed these things over, is that they had mined underneath. Now, what the process was, you made a tunnel, and it was a big enough tunnel that you could put troops through. But the idea was not to take troops through and have them come up on the other side. So they shored the insides of these tunnels with green wood, and so it wouldn't burn really quickly. And then they would light the tunnel. So the horn blowing, probably the walking around the town was probably to hide where the tunnel was being built, because people would try to listen to where the miners were building these tunnels afterwards, and on the other side, and try to countermine. In fact, there's one at Jericho, I think it's Jericho, that has bones of from both sides kind of coming in, and they actually fought. The tunnels met, and they actually fought underneath there, and then the tunnel collapsed. Usually the tunnel has to be fired, and they would they would coat the green wood with fat. In fact, we know at the Siege of Dover by King John, there's one statement that's always been misinterpreted. He says, "Put pigs in there," and that means put the pig fat in. And then they light it. The wood will eventually burn, and so the miners can get out. They have time to get out, and the mine falls down.
But I like the idea of shoving pigs in there, though. I
Well,
mean,
and the really bad movie that was done on that recently, geez, I can't even remember it. Uh, they actually do have, you hear the pigs being squealed and so forth. Look, shoving a whole
put
bunch
pigs
of
in there.
pigs into a mine does nothing except for
What's
causing
that cow doing? Get that out of here. We
yeah,
wanted pigs.
you know,
Pigs.
it's not going to do anything. I mean, yeah, dead pigs, but dead pigs are not with skin on. Not going to anyway. It was just crazy. But at Rhodes there's an explosion. So eventually, gunpowder does take over the role of firing these. So they would set fire to gunpowder, then they'd be able to move out, and the tunnel would blow up, not just burn to collapse. It would actually blow to collapse. And there's one, and we'll talk about this when we do with Rhodes in a few of the podcast. The wall goes up because it literally gets blown up by the mine, but then it settles back down, bending over onto its foundations, but bending over the moat. So now Suleiman the Magnificent, who's besieging Rhodes, has a real problem because he can't send miners in. We're going to talk about miners in just a moment. He can't send miners in because the wall may fall on him. And, Suleiman loses a lot of men there. He doesn't lose them by this type of stupidity. And so they actually pull back and let and aim their gunpowder weapons at the wall. And it takes them a week to bring down that piece of wall that had already been broken off. So mine is really effective at making a breach and everything else, even if it is pre-gunpowder day and they're just simply burning it and then going out.
So where do these guys come from who are doing this work?
They are miners. You got to have people move dirt. Who moves dirt better than miners? Who's able to get through rock better than miners? And that's the case in Round Rhodes, for example. There's a lot of limestone they have to go under, and so it's you've got to have people who can chip away with it and have the right tools and so forth. So, and if you can imagine it, a miner, we know, and the Romans did not mine themselves. They made all their slaves mine, and it was a very, very hard job anywhere. It's a very hard job to mine. Short lifespans because they've got so much toxins that breathe it in, all sorts of things. That was true for the ancient world too. So you can imagine that a miner who's out, let's say, digging copper in some local mine, and a siege army comes by and recruits them, and not only will pay him better than trying to chip out the copper from that mine, but also give him 3 meals a day. And there'll be a lot of downtime when you can't mine. So they're recruiting miners. But we called them miners. Sometimes they call them pioneers, but those are usually the men who will set the structure up underground. So the miners, the diggers, pioneers are the ones that build the structure and also will set fire to it. So they're fairly capable of doing this. And then the explosive mine really will change things by the 16th century.
And Bram asked, would they be in camp with the rest of the army?
Yeah. I'm sure they would have stuck by themselves. Soldiers being soldiers would not want to be with them. But
there's not like a separate mining camp.
We're doing a separate. All of these guys, if you think about it, we know, for example, that when Philip the Good is planning this invasion, this crusade into the east in 1454, that he has everybody is broken down into language groups. So you're not going to put the miners with people who can't understand, and they're going to have leaders that are going to be able to make the translations back and forth. And a miner is going to speak a dialect, probably because they're coming from a different town, a little specific town. They're going to speak different dialect. So they probably were separated in some way, not in the way that we would think, though, that they had they had different kitchens, they had different meals. They ate like the rest of them, and they had duties. Because they worked underground, they sometimes would work into the night, depending upon how many mines were needed. There's over 60 mines counted at one point by Jacques de Bourbon, who's a night hospitaller at Rhodes. that go in, and only a few are exploded, but 60 mines under that, and that's not a very big city that they're mining.
Yeah, it's not a huge stretch of wall. I mean, it's big, but it's not like Paris or something. And this idea of people being kind of linguistically divided up, we will be talking about that as well when we talk about the Second Siege of Rhodes. That will come up because that's something that's definitely going on within the city.
Yeah.
Because you need to have your fighting force all need to be able to communicate with each other, so you don't want them all mixed up language wise.
Yeah, in fact, at Rhodes they even call them tongues.
Yeah,
they call them tongues. So they're definitely
cool.
looking at the language.
And how far they have to tunnel, how long did it take? Well, that really depends upon, the situation, right? If we're going through a lot harder rock and a lot more of it, that takes more time. And how far did you have to go? Well, that depends a lot on the situation you're facing.
Yeah.
What is the defense have to stop your mining? Well, that can depend upon it. How much do you need to keep it out of sight? That can depend.
Yeah.
So very variable answers to that.
And also how the fortification is built. If we've got very strong walls, we've got tall walls, they're going to be they better have a better foundation if they're tall, because they got a lot more weight on them. That's easier to bring down, quite frankly, if you've got a mine underneath. If somebody's put a moat in front, which almost everybody would do in a fortification, certainly a town has a ditch. That's to keep people from actually going right up against the walls. There's no doubt about it, but it can be filled. But for a miner, if you can get in there and then start your mine in there, if you can actually get to a point where you're not attacked from the walls, they can't bring out the sorties, then moat is a little bit easier. Of course, if a moat has water, you're not going to mine underneath. You got to mine out all the way underneath that lake. So fortifications that are put near water or on precipitous terrain, Crac de Chevalier, for example, only has one route. So if you're going to mine it, it only has to be there beyond one. But even then, Belgrade in 1521 by Suleiman, he can't get into the Citadel. The Citadel's way up above the city, takes the city below, and he can't get into the Citadel. And so he actually mines underneath. It takes a month or so to dig a mine through the mountain underneath one of the tunnels, and then he uses gunpowder to explode it. It brings down, if you look at you can look at drawings of Belgrade before and after, and you can see the collapsed tower on that, because he literally brought down a whole mountain, half a mountain. It's something else. Yeah, but mining. You're right. I mean, it's a great question, because when we talk about sieges, there's no mining underneath Orleans. I just did some work on Siege of Orleans again, 1428, 29. There's no mines. You can't undermine the Loire River, and they didn't have enough people to mine on any other place around the side of the city either.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Next question. Jonathan on Twitter asks. Jonathan rolled into my Twitter feed to ask, what did medieval field medicine look like? Were there any notable treatments? Was there a medical corps? Was there were wounded and dead troops removed from the field during battle? Were nobility treated differently? How much did things change over time? In some, was there a haggard old man who went from tent to tent with a red hot iron cauterizing wounds? Great.
Probably, yeah. I'm getting to that haggard old man age now, so I'm thinking more and more that there was some use for us old guys.
Put down the hot iron, Kelly. Put down the hot iron.
Put down the iron. We should say right off the bat that it is not medicine at that point; it's surgery. Most of these, and there are surgeons all over. I mean, just recall, of course, the contract with the Genoese that the French had with the Genoese galleys, and in a fleet for every 10 galleys, there had to be a surgeon. and the surgeon had to be picked by the French king. So he didn't want like the Genoese captain to say, "Oh yeah, I've got my idiot brother over here, can't do anything. I'm going to call him surgeon." They actually had to be able to do things. Early in my career, I did an article on gunshot wounds and how that differed. So I learned a lot more about military surgery than I had thought I would. And I found that it's a little bit different. Surgeons are always with a group. That goes all the way back into ancient Egypt. Really, they had surgeons with their armies, and the people in the Mediterranean diaspora had a different. They followed some specific rules that come down to us through the Greeks, and cauterization is big. Okay, cauterization. So if you've got an open wound, you've got to cauterize it. The reason is that it's hotter, and it's going to gangrene is going to set in, infection is going to set in pretty quickly. In the north of the Alps, it's a little bit easier, and so there they seem to cleanse the wound and suture it or suppurate it. There's very little amputation done in comparison to the south. And it's just because of the speed of infection in a wound is much less. By the end of the Middle Ages, they actually had these wound men, and they're fun to look at. Go out and look up wound men, and you'll see some of them in manuscripts, others of them in early printed books, and it's basically every type of wound that a guy could have. But they've got him standing in a field. Standing in a field, he stepped on a caltrop. He has a sword in his head. All the way up
a club. It
is hilarious, and you're getting the idea, that surgeons this is a manual for surgeons so that they know what type of wounds that they're going to encounter. The medieval physicians, medical people who were in a town and were taking care of, the equivalent of Fifi, the dog, in human form. They're not having to do as many of these type of surgeries and so forth and so on. They have to deal with many more things. But military surgery is a fascinating field that we don't know as much about as we should.
And there would have been these guys on campaign, as Kelly said. We got them in these contracts. We know that they, Harry V takes them on Agincourt, on the Agincourt campaign. We know of them. We don't always have records of them being along, but you probably want somebody to try and take care of your men if you could. Should things happen, and we do have some accounts of the treatments.
Yeah.
So Kelly was just talking about cauterizing. Again, in the medieval warfare reader, I feel like this is just becoming a medieval warfare reader advertisement. Advertisement for those playing along elsewhere. We have a cauterizing scene of Don Pero Nino, who's quite a fascinating guy in his own right. And it's in Seville. He's taken a really bad wound to the leg, and they goes to the best surgeons in Seville, and they want to take his foot because they're worried about gangrene setting in, and basically want to cut this thing off. And he's like, "No, I don't know. Let's cauterize it."
Yeah.
And the surgeon heats up the red hot poker to do this, but then won't do it. He's afraid to do it because the pain that this is going to be. He won't do it to Pero Nino. And this is the source we've got. We're talking about this, and here's just a snippet of it. But Pero Nino, who was already used to such work, took the glowing iron in his hand and himself moved it all over his leg from one end of the wound to the other, without stopping. They gave him a second like it, and he applied it for the second time. He was not seen during all this time to give a single sign of pain. No one heard him make any complaint. Thenceforward, his wound was well dressed, and it pleased God that each day it should mend.
And I talked to a surgeon after we read that, because almost everybody will read Per Nino, and it's a fun account. Kind of this life of this Spanish soldier is just really interesting, because he's pretty much a Superman. He goes out there. There's one battle scene, where he's wounded in many places. He's got a crossbow stuck in his nasal, and the guy's hit it with the shield, and he just says, "No, let's stop this shit." Just ends the guy's life right there. So I have a little bit of sympathy to the surgeon who didn't want to cauterize. I said, is it possible to cauterize your own wound? And the surgeon said, if you're kind of used to pain, to this type
Yeah.
of pain, which apparently, would be having been on campaign for many, many times, he says you could do it as long as you don't pass out. It's certainly possible to do. I mean, we've got stories of people who don't get taken care of, like Richard Lionheart, who,
Yeah.
I got a little wound in my arm, on my belt
I'm
of cheese.
fine.
Let me walk around for 6 days till I get gangrene. And all those Richard haters out there, like me, that we're going to get some hate mail for that one. Yeah, Richard Lionheart, not a particularly good
Yeah.
or
Kelly doesn't like
or
Richard.
man.
Neither do
No,
I.
I don't know. I don't.
Uh,
It does help
you
when
know,
you have John follow you, because then
yeah. Well, he
everybody
always
can
makes
say,
anybody
"Well,
look
he was
better.
a terrible king, but he's not John."
He's not John. He's
Yeah,
better than him.
but he walked around. He walked around with gangrenous sore, and it killed him.
Yeah, what an idiot. So one of the other questions here that Jonathan asks is were the nobility treated differently?
Yeah.
And the answer is yeah, they were. Yeah, a lot. That is shocking, I know, but
Yeah.
yeah, way different. And again, as part of our continuing advertisement, I would point you to the Medieval Warfare Reader. On pages 284, 285, we give you the account, and it's one of these. I can't believe this thing exists. It's just incredible, and we'll
Yeah.
probably talk about it for our next episode when we talk about Shrewsbury, because at the Battle of Shrewsbury, Prince Hal of Shakespeare fame, the future Henry V, he's 16 years old. He's at the battle. He's in charge of one wing of the army, and he takes an arrow to the face, which is already crazy enough. But he takes an arrow to the face, and it looks like they pull the arrow, but the arrowhead stays in his head, and
In the
so they're
back of the
trying to.
skull. In the
Well,
back.
that's what we.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where I figure out it probably is. But yeah, we know that the arrowhead's still in his head, and they're trying to figure out what the hell to do, and they bring in all these different surgeons, and everybody's like, I'm not touching it. I can't do anything about it, until finally they do get this one fellow, a surgeon from London, to come up, John Bradmore. And John Bradmore shows up and is like, no, I got a plan for this, and actually does ultimately extract this arrowhead and he writes the report, surgeon's report, from a depth of 6 inches in future Henry V's skull. Again, I think the arrowhead is ultimately lodged at the base of his skull next to his spine in the back. That's the reason they won't push it out. Normally, you kind of just shove it out the other side. That's the easiest thing. Rather than pulling an arrow backwards, you're going to tear all kinds of stuff. But they can't do that in this case, and they can't leave it. And so yeah, he ultimately does this by widening the wound, which is extraordinary. Goes through all the details of how he does this. It's amazing. Builds an instrument. Goes down to the blacksmith. Like, here's what I need you to do. I need you to look like this. Builds an instrument that he can put into the wound, and grab the arrowhead from the inside of the arrowhead, sort of like a reverse pincher. Can sort of extend out and grab the inside of the arrowhead, and then pull the thing out, and then repack the wound, and somehow do this without general anesthesia. And he does it, and he writes about it, and we have the account, and it's translated. I translate it for you. Page 284, 285. Incredible. They didn't do that for normal people.
No. No, although it's interesting because they do have these surgeons you read about. They're really quite innovative because they're dealing with things that they wouldn't normally deal with, and it's precisely like anybody who's a military medic now has to deal with things, and they have to make changes and on a spur of a moment to save somebody's life. The down in the Mediterranean, and you got a crossbow bolt in your shoulder or someplace like that, not necessarily in the head, like Henry had. They turn a crossbow around, so they grab the end of the bolt and hook it to the string of the crossbow, withdraw the crossbow string, and then shoot the crossbow, and
Yeah.
that would jerk it out so quickly that it would the pain would be would be minimal. It's like taking a Band-Aid off very quickly.
Yeah, rip the Band-Aid off.
Except you're taking a crossbow bolt head out of somebody's
Ugh.
skin or bone or whatever. One of the more interesting ones I found was looking at Charles the Bold. So he's last Valois Burgundian Duke, died in 1477 at the Battle of Nancy. So the records of what different groups he has in his army are always quite fascinating. One of them is a surgical group, and it says that they're complaining. Now, this is the early days of handguns. We've got a lot more in Charles's army than we have elsewhere. And if you think about a handgun at this period of time, I mean, it's a tube. It has a touch hole. Well, what's blowing back out that touch hole is the gunpowder flash as coming over. And they're holding it down around their waist. Nobody's putting up their eye. That's just stupid. At this point, you can't sight one of these things anyway because the barrels are smooth bore. So they've got it down. We see these pictures, the art with them down there. But the back blast is coming straight into the gunner's face. So the biggest complaint the surgeons had on this campaign that was into Switzerland, I think this was Swiss campaigns, was that the back blast. The back blast coming out of the touch hole was burning the face, and they'd run out of balm. And they said, now we got gunners who are complaining that they've got these burnt faces, gunpowder burnt faces. We've run out of balm for them. So sometimes it wasn't stitching together somebody or pulling a bolt head out or whatever. It was simply taking care of the kind of artificially sunburned face of a gunner in Charles the Bold's army.
Yeah, wounds and wound care. Wounds and wound care.
Yeah, wound and wound repair.
It was a real thing, and I'm glad, Jonathan, that you are thinking about those who are wounded in warfare, because again, a lot of folks don't. A lot of folks kind of ignore that when they're talking about military history. But it is absolutely a big part of things, is taking care of your forces, one way or another. So Bob, excellent question.
Yeah, it is an excellent question. Bob Wisdom Savage and I wrote a kind of a article for a collection on wounds and wound repair that Kat Tracy and I edited. And what we did was we took, because Bob was in charge of the wounds or the weapons that caused wounds on Richard III's body. As the curator of weapons at the time at the Armouries, and I put together a catalog of all the excavations to show how many excavations show wounds in bodies. Well, we could see them in Towton, we could see them in Visby, where we have large numbers. We see them at the Battle of Zutphen in 1499. There's a whole bunch of skulls in the Museum of Bern that have obvious wounds that have caused the battle. When we put this all together, it stretches it from the Roman period all the way into the 16th century, and it is very interesting to see how many wounds are there and how many people survive. I mean, there'll be people. So the one at Towton that has a wound in the head that killed him, probably been ridden down and hit with a warhammer, it looks like. But he's also got a cut in his lower jaw that had been repairing itself for about 30 years or so. So he had fought, this is, and his age-related data puts him in his 50s. So he fought as a young man and would have fought in France. And now he's at the Battle of Towton getting wounded as well.
And that one, we've got great reconstructions of what that guy probably looked like with that.
He would not have been pretty.
He was not pretty.
Not have been pretty, that's for sure. The best one was what they call a Gothic Hunnic warrior. One of these graves that was around that period of the early Middle Ages, and the guy had a wound in his head by a blunt force trauma. So he had blunt force trauma, which was a wound in his head, and it had at least 6 months of repair. Now that the wound, according to the forensic archaeologist who was studying it, said it would have gotten through the membrane of the brain. So through the skull and in the membrane of the brain. And the guy lived for 6 months. He may have been the village idiot, but he'd lived for 6 months afterwards. So these are pretty hardy folk. We've got to figure as well. And the soldiers that took care of them on the battlefield, they were pretty hardy as well. But this is a
Yeah.
good subject. We can do more on it because we've got Shrewsbury next week. Love to get into Giovanni de Vigo at the end of the Middle Ages and how he screws everybody up, and Amboise Paré at the beginning, Battle of Pavia, where he runs out of oil and so forth. So sometime we'll have to elaborate on this because medieval military surgery is fascinating.
Yeah. And inadequately treated.
Inadequate,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's just, I mean, there are manuals out there. There a manual that was discovered that was written by a Teutonic Knight surgeon in northeastern Europe. So this is 15th century, never been translated, and it really should because it tells tremendous, and it's almost entirely military wound based, which many of the surgery manuals.
What is the language it's written in, Kelly?
Oh, one of the High Germans.
One of the Germans.
Yeah, one of the.
So
Germans.
if we have any Middle High German or High Middle or any of those different, it depends on how many Germans you think there are. But anybody out there who knows medieval German stuff, wanting a project, talk to Kelly.
Translation of that.
We'll hook you up.
Yeah, there are others who need translations of too.
There's so much stuff that needs translation.
So
translation doesn't get as much glory as it should because someone translates something and immediately we all have access to it, and it is such a wonderful thing to be doing, and not enough people do it.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
I think we got time for maybe one more here before they kick us out. So let's Lane Quick asks on our Patreon page, and this is kind of related to we were talking earlier about communication. How fast did news of an event or battle travel beyond the immediate area? And he says in particular, he was watching Vikings Valhalla, and it had the St. Brice's massacre. How long after that would King Canute know about this, and who would tell him? Well, it wouldn't be King Canute. That's the first thing there. He was not king yet. He was a wee lad. He was a wee lad. We think he was about 12?
Yeah, about 12. And this now it's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which reports this. Peterborough Chronicle reports pretty extensively. Does not give an indication that it provokes the campaign of conquest the next year that's undertaken by Sweyn Forkbeard the next year.
Yeah.
So Canute's father, Canute may have been on that. He would have been about 12 when it happened. When it goes, it does happen the year after. And John of Wallingford, 13th century writer, will try to connect the two. So it's not just modern historians connect the two. It all depends on that. We've got two different time frames we've got to look at in that case. I mean, it looks like it took a year for Sweyn to answer because the St. Brice massacre 1002, Forkbeard's attacking 1003. But remember, he's got to muster his troops. He's got to gather an army. Right. He's got to respond. So it may not have taken very long. Now, in this case, we're talking about a sea in between. It's not. We're not. You cannot send signals from. You can send them across bays. You can send them across small inlets, but you cannot send them across the Baltic Sea, for example, or the North Sea.
Yeah, that information has to be sailed there.
It has to be sailed there. We do know that information that there are probably messengers that are going by ship, but if not, there's certainly rumors that the ships will take back and forth. We know this strangely from how fast theological decisions get made in the Mediterranean area. When you've got the Council of Nicaea saying something, then all of a sudden, people in Rome find out about it in like a week. You go, how's that possible? Well, they're sailing, and there is a ship going from Constantinople to Rome, no doubt. And somebody on it is giving the news, and people in Rome are more interested in that. And so any big news is going to take some time. And the St. Brice's massacre would probably have been a ship. The next ship going out would have carried that to the Danes.
Yeah,
and I think it was meant to be. Let's face it. I mean, Ethelred meant that to be taken around to the Danes to frighten them into stopping. So,
yeah, Um, I think you can correct me on this, Kelly. I would trust your word more than mine on this exact question. When I'm trying to think about the reconstruction of events, generally speaking, unless I know that we're dealing with sightline communications, which are signal fires and stuff like that, which can only transfer so much information, right?
Right.
It's basically like something bad, light the fire if this bad thing happens. Okay, like that information can get there really quick, right? If you see the Spanish Armada, light the fire, and if that happens, information, it's speed of light essentially. So that's super, that's great. But typically, really, information is only going to travel as fast as a person can get that information there. So I usually tend to think, all right, well, how fast on horseback can you get from point A to point B? And in the case of the sea, how fast can a ship get from point A to point B? Add those things up, and that's how much time it took the information to get there,
Yeah.
because there's no other real means of doing this reliably. Yeah, there are those exceptions. Like I said, the Spanish Armada, news of that, off the shore, that was
Yeah.
known in London right quick, because they had a system set up for that. But it's because there was a pre-decided message that could be sent that way. You can't sort of like semaphore messages with fire. Like
No.
that's not really a thing. Smoke signals aren't really like a thing for giving a lot of detailed information.
Yeah.
So it really is the case that somebody physically has got to get things from point A to B, or a sequence of people, right? I
Right.
get it to you, you get it to you, get it to you, and then it gets there. So yeah, it's a great question. How fast did news travel? And again, honestly, for my part, I look at the map, start doing the mileage, and start figuring speeds, and well, there's my
Yeah.
answer.
And I think
And it usually tracks.
main forces, the Roman army is going to be able to use signal fires better than others. Charlemagne, we know, has signal fires as well, and just yes, no, warning, da da da. But they're going to have
Yeah,
different colors of flame. They're going to have different colors of smoke, which you can do very easily uh, with just putting a water on top of a fire. A little bit will change the smoke, so you can figure on that. But yes, word of mouth,
yeah,
written word, something like that. One of the things we've got to do sometime, at least in a question and answer thing, is talk about news bulletins, which seem to be
yeah,
for the news of battles and so forth. I mean, Edward III writes something immediately after the Battle of Crecy that say that he's won the battle and that it's gone, and who has died in it. Now, the irony, of course, we mentioned this, is he doesn't get the who died right.
he got him 50% right.
50% right, but he did get the battle
Yes,
news right, and that
he
gets
did
to
win.
London really fast. So that,
Yep.
but that's the purpose. He wants it to get to London fast. He needs to get recruits out to Calais. Even more, he needs to get the people there to know that he's still alive and things are going well.
Yep.
So propaganda, Caesar's same thing with Julius Caesar sending word into Rome. So I think communication really needs to be studied a lot better, and we need to chart a lot of these things. When does the event happen, and when does it is it heard, at what distance is it heard?
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. And then chart the roads, chart other things, recognize how fast a man can ride on a horse. These aren't the Pony Express days, so we're not killing horses as we go along to deliver a few
Right.
pieces of mail. But
And I mean, as Co was just saying, even on a good, well-established site system with well, this color, this, and this kind of thing, that that has to be prearranged. You can't send news of the St. Brice's Day massacre, to use the example that Lane Quick uses here. You can't, that information you couldn't transfer because you didn't know that there was going to be a massacre. So you can't be like,
no.
it happened.
Oh, geez,
That's not a thing.
lots dead.
Yeah. So all you could do is like signal like something happened. Like, well,
Yeah,
what happened? Something good? Something bad? Like, what are we looking at? So it really is. It's gotta, people got to take it.
yeah,
People got to take it.
and in the case of the Romans and the coastline of Britannia, which we know where some of the signal stations were because of the remains, often they were just saying, "Yeah, Wall been attacked.
We've
Hadrian's
been
Wall.
attacked.
If I've got a fire going up, bring
Yeah.
troops. Send troops.
Gondor calls for aid.
Yeah, that's right.
Gondor calls for aid. Wouldn't it have been sad if Rohan had showed up and they're like, that's not what we were signaling. We were actually signaling.
We're signaling bring beer.
Yeah, we want more beer. Like, you thought that? Oh man.
Oh man.
Boy,
You'd fire your signal bearer, wouldn't you, at that point?
But again, I mean, that is a great example, though, of fantasy. It may be, but right, the signal fire means X, and so when the signal fire is lit, the message is correctly received because it's already pre-established what that must mean. That's the way a sightline communication works.
Yeah, and I mean, we're starting to get the lights dim on us and all, but
yeah, man.
Next question period, maybe we'll talk about how communication made on a battlefield.
Man,
and
too much fun.
Sightline until gunpowder starts, black smoke starts going, and then the sound. Yep. But Philip Contamine, who passed not too recently, one of the great military historians in the Middle Ages, and who was kind of the grandfather to all of us who are studying this. He passed this year. And he wrote a very interesting article on music, using music and the different sounds from trumpets and tubas and other things that they were using on the battlefield to send messages back and forth around it. And I think it's very, very well done. As all of Contamine stuff was very well done.
Well, good questions. We encourage you to keep sending these things. You can send them to social media channels that we're on, or visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/medievalists. Put in questions there, and we'll get them. We'll get them. They'll get to us. So, right. Thanks for joining us as ever, and hope you join us next time where we're going to be talking about that Battle of Shrewsbury that we've referenced here a couple times because it's a cool battle.
We'll have to decide on how we pronounce Owen Glendower. Is it Glendower? Do we use straight English or Glendower?
Glendour. Oh, we got to Welsh this thing.
I think we're going to have some nice whiskey for that battle.
Oh, I'm probably going to get myself some Penderin is what I'm going to get. I'm already thinking ahead.
There we go.
So as ever, a reminder, this podcast is sponsored by medievalist.net. So the best way to support us, other than buying our individual books, of course, is to join their Patreon at patreon.com/medievalists. And thank you for joining us. Hope everybody has a good few days.
Yeah. And Mike, enjoy Greece. I'm jealous as hell, man.
Oh yeah, I'm going to Greece. See y'all later. Bye-bye.
Bye.